día de hoy y mañana, en donde nos daremos a la tarea de reflexionar sobre ciertos procesos desde donde la violencia y otras formas y otros procesos han reconfigurado la manera en la que concebimos el territorio, la política y de qué manera esta reconceptualización territorial, política e histórica también articula nuevas formas y nuevas relaciones entre la política y la estética. Es decir, de qué manera las crisis sociales y las políticas de globalización, así como las formas de violencia, producen y plantean complejos problemas que no serían ajenos al saber de las ciencias, de las humanidades y del arte. Es por ello que hoy, en el marco de la exposición Forensic Architecture y de la Cátedra de Investigación Helen Escobedo sobre estética y política, nos damos a la tarea de reflexionar sobre los límites entre países, los problemas de migración, los fenómenos de nomadismo y racismo, así como las formas en las que se manifiesta la violencia, de qué manera estas desbordan los sistemas sociales, políticos y jurídicos, desde donde se determinan las políticas de lo visual. Espero que a lo largo del día podamos avanzar críticamente y podamos preguntarnos cómo o desde dónde franjas, muros y fronteras quizás sean categorías insuficientes para pensar la cartografía política y social que define al mundo contemporáneo. Quisiera darle también la bienvenida a Mónica Mieva, subdirectora de programas públicos, quien nos dará unas palabras en este momento.
Hola, buenos días. Pues yo les quiero dar la bienvenida y también agradecer su presencia en nombre de la maestra Graciela de la Torre, directora del Muac y también de la Dirección General de Artes Visuales de la UNAM. Estamos muy contentos. Esta jornada resulta especialmente importante para el museo porque dialoga por una parte con el programa público de la exposición Forensic Architecture, Acción Estética Investigativa, que esperemos que todos puedan visitar si es que no lo han hecho. Y también se enmarca esta jornada en la Cátedra Extraordinaria Helen Escobedo, Estética, Política e Historiografía Crítica del Arte Contemporáneo en México y en América Latina. De igual manera, para nosotros va a nutrir buena parte de las líneas de trabajo del programa académico de Campus Expandido a cargo de la doctora Elisa Mizrahi, en líneas como Estética y Política, Cultura Visual y Espacio Público. Franjas, Muros y Fronteras, Geoestética Contemporánea, dedica este programa a reflexionar sobre un tema de gran relevancia, como ya lo dijo Lisa, para los estudios críticos de la cultura, y es un tema urgente en nuestro contexto actual. Los flujos migratorios y las maneras bajo las cuales la fotografía, el cine, el documental, el video, el periodismo y la narrativa lo visibilizan o lo ocultan. De esta manera, el Muac se abre una vez más como un foro de debate cívico, social y público, donde se problematiza lo político y se conciben las prácticas estéticas contemporáneas como estéticas que afectan el tejido social y que problematizan también relatos oficiales. Bueno, pues no me queda más que agradecer nuevamente a todos y a cada uno de ustedes su presencia, a los participantes, también a todos los asistentes presenciales y virtuales que nos acompañan el día de hoy, a la Universidad Iberoamericana que también estuvo colaborando para la realización de estas jornadas, y a la Fundación Ford también por hacer el encuentro posible. Y bueno, pues esperamos que estos días sean intercambios enriquecedores para todos y bueno, comencemos. Gracias.
Gracias, Mónica. Bueno, vamos a pasar a la primera conferencia. Les pido unos minutitos nada más para instalar técnicamente la computadora y damos inicio. Gracias. Yes.
question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Y aquí adelante para Brad, el que está allá. Bueno, pues ahora sí daremos inicio a la primera conferencia magistral del día de hoy. Está a cargo de David Theo Goldberg, director de la Universidad de California, profesor de literatura comparada, estudios afroamericanos, criminología, derecho y sociedad en la Universidad de California, Irving de California. Dentro de sus publicaciones más recientes destacan A Real Post-Racial Yet, Between Humanities and the Digital, The Threat of Race, entre otras. Es codirector y fundador de Hashtag Humanities, Art, Science, Technology, Advanced Collaboratory, un consorcio internacional, y presidente de la Universidad de California, System White House, Humanities, Art, Social Science y Consejo de Tecnología. Para mí es un gusto y un honor tenerlo aquí entre nosotros el día de hoy. Le voy a dar la palabra para que podamos escucharlo. Gracias. Thank you, David.
Buenos días. It's a pleasure to be back at Muac. And thank you for being here this morning. So the election of a sitcom to the American presidency grounds the fascination and the dread. We awaken each day to a question about each. What's the next episode? What the horror facing us now? In fact, they turn out to be the same question. In a sense, dread is a function exactly of this mixing of genres, of the indistinguishability. We can no longer draw the distinction. We are, to borrow a phrase, phenomenologically fucked. Where indistinction becomes generalized between war and peace, between everyday practice and corruption, between desire and demand or command, between work and recreation, or work as recreation, and recreation as work, or what in the US is commonly called a workout, between human and techness, between the next ecological disaster and the next 5-minute news cycle, etc., etc. Dread has become a driving affect of our moment. Dread, you could say, is the name of this moment, of its seeming inscrutability, its illegibility, where the improbable has become likely. We rationalize repeated raging hurricanes and the quaking earth as acts of nature, but like famines and floods, the destruction they wrought is invariably anthropocenic, prompted and enabled by human short-sightedness. Inaction, overaction, or overreaction, intervention. Dread drips from the pervasive sense that extinction could strike in a blinding moment, as you recently experienced here in the city. War machines increasingly came to drive the economy of 20th century modernity. A new generation of war machines has marked neoliberal and now trans-neoliberal capital. We're losing the ability even to name precisely the fast-evolving predicament of our moment, post-trans, endo, as in endo-liberalism in the Foucauldian sense, liberalism within, etc., etc. I mean, we're losing the capacity even to nail it down, so to speak. And in particular, their proliferation throughout everyday life. Automatic weapons, drones, GPS, driverless vehicles, face recognition technology, etc., etc. Today, war-like work is becoming increasingly roboticized. Drones, you could say, are the first step. AI-driven warfare, artificial intelligence-driven warfare, the managing of, strategizing about, and increasingly the execution of war is fast developing to the point of autonomy, of algorithmic self-definition. The algorithmic is quickly becoming the mode not just of production, but of sociality itself. Its modus operandi, its operating logic, instantiates and deepens the increasing inscrutability of the logic of production and relationality, and by extension, the loss of control as both sensed and fact. Hence the contemporary concerns about transparency, self-determination, and sovereignty, Brexit, Trump, IFD in Germany, are all manifestations of these deeper twists. You could say the latter's symptomology. The triangulation of unpiloted technological targeting, acceleration, think North Korean nuclear capacity, and loss of control intensifies the threat I'm pointing to. The benefits of these war machines pervade and consume our everyday functionality now, further blurring the distinctions. War-peace, proliferating to the point of indiscernible low-intensity wars or microaggressions, slow violence, and not only of the ecological kind, though that too. Games of war and war games. I mean, these distinctions are all collapsing. I mean, the very sense that we inherit our daily technology that we use, our phones, our computers, GPS, I mean, whatever you name as the new technology of the moment, right, are inherited from militarized R&D. I mean, they, all for the last at least 200 years, think of the telegraph onwards, military R&D has transformed into the technology of everyday life. Constant state of war, but of its more or less undiminished and continual dread. The dread of its outbreak, of its conduct, of its violence, of its effects. Sorry, infinitum keeps wanting to claim my life, right? Which is partly what I'm talking about, of course. Of war as such, conventionally comprehended, but more generalizably of a war. The indiscernibility of the indefinite article indicative of the proliferated insecurity. A war on everything, on poverty, on drugs, on crime, on the environment, nature, the climate, on neighbors, on immigrants, on refugees. We have come to live then in proliferating dread, even of dread itself. I mean, this is a very, very interesting image if you think about it, right? A refugee, Macedonian border, right, ringed by or held off by a militarized set of policing. You're not going to cross the border or crossing the tracks, performing in front of, right, the media stretched out alongside military, right? So, I mean, there's a performativity by the media, by the police, indeed by the refugee person himself, right, in relation to the constant relationality that is this proliferation of dread. Civil war is morphed from the politics of extreme exception or occasional outburst to that of the commonplace, the everyday. Civil war is no longer the end of politics, but its normalized expression. Civil war is a clash of competing conceptions of how to live in the world, of social inscrutability in the name of transparency, and proliferated paranoia, unsafety, insecurity in the service of the technologics of security. So this is a Joe Arpaio prison before he got kicked out as the sheriff in Arizona, in Maricopa County. And, you know, these guys have not yet been sentenced, and yet they've been sentenced by him, the sheriff, right, outside the domain of the law, right, to a kind of, again, a kind of projected, performative set of uniforms that are to convey the condition under which they live. So rights have completely disappeared in this environment. States descend into civil wars when contrasting conceptions of life within them are deemed irreconcilable. Living for a considerable proportion of the state's inhabitants is made unbearable. Those at least nominally controlling the state apparatus insist on obedience and deference to its way of being, on pain of erasure for refusal or resistance. Where governance is substituting for institutional politics, civil wars are struggles over competing ways of being in the world. I mean, this is also an incredible image, right? The title of it is called The Tale of Two Hoodies, right? So here you have a clash of ways of being in the world. It was painted by the artist after the Trayvon Martin killing and placed on Instagram. It was banned from Instagram as promoting the NRA, right? Instagram apparently has some edict that says you can't post NRA promoting, violence promoting kinds of images on it. And the artist then counted 1,500 other representations promoting the NRA, while this was banned as a way of calling into question that very condition. There are struggles over their underlying conceptions and over control of the state and its apparatuses to materialize and advance these commitments. Colonial existence, as Achille Mbembe has noted, riffing off Fanon, is a permanent state of agitation, a state of constant alarm. These are constitutive conditions of coloniality, not just byproducts or occasional effective states in colonial societies. The sovereignty of colonized states was always in question. Globalization has updated and heightened this alarm by blurring anew some aspects of the boundaries between states, drawing into question the absoluteness of even metropolitan state sovereignty. As state sovereignty has frayed at the edges, at the very least, if not eroded, social conflict has gripped state culture. Where politics has become civil war, dread has become its leakage. At the outset and in the end, civil wars are not foremost about resorting to arms, even as they may quickly gear up to blows. For the struggle to be considered blow-worthy, the contrast must be palpable and pressing. The commitments animating civil war that constitutes infinitum, that constitutes the political today are forced appeals to a contrasting set of commitments. I will call these oppositional contrasts, riffing off A.L. Weizmann, who's on display here at the moment, the conceptual conflict shoreline, obviously after his book, The Conflict Shoreline. These competing conceptions are conflicts in the making, enlarged between commitments to closed and open worlds, to homogeneous and heterogeneous social ecologies, to purity and mestizaje, to securitizing and convivial states. There are obviously more nuanced lived and negotiated between and multifold states than these broad contrasts. But the broader and more fixed the contrast, the more uncompromising the commitment to a single side, the more readily one can characterize this as civil or really incivil social warring. The force is one-sided in a double sense. One-sided in forcing one's commitments onto those uninterested in or even indifferent to, disagreeing with, and especially resisting them. But one-sided in the even more pressed sense that the force is almost invariably the product of a state's homogenizing commitment. It is the inevitable effect of the fixation on curtailed homogeneity, on authority, the compulsion in make-believe, command, content, fixity, perhaps even self-recursively on fixation itself. When you think about make-believe, I mean, there's a doubling, right? There's the fantasy of make-believe, the making things up in whole cloth from the beginning, anything goes. But there's also the compulsiveness and the compulsion, the making believe, right, that Trump so readily stands for. You know, he can tell you anything he wants. He'll make it up, he'll fabricate it, but he'll force you to believe it by forcing it upon you. It's that sense of make-believe that I'm referencing here. So the struggle, in short, comes down to that between manipulated control at any and all cost and to co-constitutive interactive engagement. Civil struggles that blow up into full-fledged wars, whether conceptually or materially, culturally or politico-economically, require people to declare their commitments. We are encouraged, if not forced, to take sides. The Irish Civil War on your left, the English Revolution on the right, and the way in which the culture of civil war has invaded gaming culture and so on and so forth. Right? This is demanded of both members of the society and distant observers, as you can see. Even neutrality in the face of impending death and destruction in the final analysis is itself side-taking. It should be obvious that racialities mark these warring contrasts. Racialities help both to shape and sharpen them. Race reflects and animates, at least partly constitutes and exacerbates these conditions, as we've seen in Charlottesville not so long ago. Those identifying with social openness and heterogeneity, with accountability, constitutionality, responsibility, respect, dignity, the evidential, the transnational, with relationality and cohabitation, with co-composed futures, regulated fairness and caretaking states will be equated with, if not straightforwardly, as racially other. They will be marked as minoritarian, as past or romanticized failed states. They will be taken to be aligned with or maligned as the racially or ethno-racially distinct. They will be equated with or as the non-belonging, literally with or as the non-white, the black. I mean, you can see the inversion over here, right? The contrast between very fine people and sons of bitches and who's being identified with whom. I mean, Trump's characterization. Even their wayward supporters, as otherwise presumed white, will be treated by equation with the less than, no matter the amount of trying, never quite white, as Homi Bama once put it. Race is a cement in the architecture of modern sociality. It is a prompt and product of contempt, of homogeneity, of social warring, their medium and outcome. It is a deeply relational condition. Racism anywhere is sustainable, you might argue, only by racisms elsewhere. I mean, racism in one place is shored up by the fact, if it were only in that one place, it would soon sort of fall under the weight of its own burden, right? It requires being shored up with other forms of raciality around it. It is a violence in the waiting, in the making, offense and defense, embodied and enacted. A civil war then immediately draws a sharp line, the line in the sand of the conflict shoreline. On one side are those claiming to be or to assume the side of the state as status quo, of law and order, no matter how unjust, often silently, but increasingly vociferously as the white, right? Or the black, right? On the other are those for whom the powers and social arrangements the state represents fall critically short, and in defense of which the state resorts to repressive violence. Those outside the territorial line, those marked for and by preclusion, more often than not, are those characterized as unbelonging and undeserving. They will be cast out as outsiders within. They are tarred with the, they're getting really insistent, right? They will be tarred, they are tarred with the brush of racial difference. First elaborations, then remainders of race. In a world with no more transcendental gods and the unleashing of generalized uncertainty, race, as I've argued elsewhere, is the secularization of the religious. So there's an historical argument over here that race takes over the work that religiosity through the medieval had overwhelmingly done. The sense of origin narrative, the sense of kinship structure, all those things, right? God is dead, Marx is dead, and I'm not feeling so well myself, as Ionesco once put it. There's a pop song now too with that chorus, indicative of the generalizing of the condition from high to mass sensibility. Religious wars, historically marking the European landscape, today are nothing short of race wars, internalized, about self-proclaimed origin narratives, about make-believe kinship, not so long ago widely and explicitly called blood. You see it again here. Now resurrected in the hot white rights chant of blood and soul as they goose-stepped with torches across Charlottesville. About the landscape and its ownership, about access and privilege, about control and its subjects or subjections over resources and decision-making, and truth claims and facts and evidence, about cultural legacy and its parental provenance, which is to say about its heritage, but also about its proper inheritance, its rightful heirs, in whose name the culture will supposedly live on as defining traces, even while being remade. At its core, about the right to be, to belong, the intersecting and interacting epistemological and ontological powers of determination and self-determination. The line keeping outsiders out works in terms of racial determination, of immigration, and the technologies of bordering. So here I am with the theme of the conference. In America's case, these racial determinations reach across the lines of the historical and contemporary. Today, Mexicans or Latin Americans more generally, and Muslims. If the hot white right had their way, blacks and Jews too. You see it sort of represented, I'm not sure you can fully read this, but I'll leave you to struggle with it in the interest of time. The line marking insiders as not fully belonging is inscribed in terms of fantasized differentiations in blood, bones, and behavior, culture and character, projected incapacity, and lack of intelligence. Though if these presumptions are anything to go by, it seems clear the incapacity and lack of intelligence lives inside rather than outside the wall. The preclusions are enacted in the name of maintaining historical homogeneity in the face of its undoing. But the maintenance, first of the fantasy of differentiated being and capacity, and then of its enactment, is possible only by the compulsions of make-believe. This conservation requires force and forced constraint of thought and deed, of compelled movement and sedentarism, temporary encampments, perhaps collapsing the two. A couple of points need stressing here. That the homogeneity needs to be maintained speaks to its artifice. It's a labor to maintain it. Presumed the natural, the default state of social being, it is anything but. And that maintenance requires force, intrusion. It requires repression, if not purge, of the supposedly polluting ideas and then the people who are drawn to them. The racial wall, whether ideational or material, is at once symbolic of the boundary lines and cementation of who a welcome social member and who lacking social standing, even, you might say, as human or fully human. Consider as one example among many, France's generation identitaire, effectively their youth millennial outright core, producing a video entitled Declaration of War. So here's a clip. I mean, you can go and Google it. The video's online. And here's a clip of the voiceover to the video. And again, you can read it clearly enough. I'll just end with, declaring themselves to be victims of an explosion of anti-white racism, they conclude this is a declaration of war. So this is the 20-something generation in France today. Not even in Paris, in France more broadly. Right? The alarm is no longer the occasional fire drill or ducking for cover during nuclear drills. It is today the constant ringing in the ears. For Kierkegaard, dread as a psychic or affective condition or state is produced in the face of nothing. It's interesting that, what gets translated into English, I don't know what they've done in Spanish, as the essay on fear is actually in the essay on dread. Right? The first English translation actually captured it, and then the more popular translation made it fear. And there's a contrast that I'm going to argue about between dread and fear. So it's produced in the face of nothing, by not being, by non-occurrence, by absence. Unlike fear and more like melancholia, it has no, dread has no defined object. Dread then follows from lack of possibility, of predictability, of principle, where even the known unknowns are obtuse, are exactly unknown unknowns, a reference you might conjure. Precisely there, the emptiness is filled with dread. Hortense Spillers has commented that actual power, her term, causes fear. Symbolic power does not necessarily, as one can, as she says, take it or leave it. End of the expressions of symbolic power, I'm suggesting, prompt dread. Dread is phobogenic in Fanon's terms. The nagging dissatisfaction and anxiety, lacking any identifiable prompt or cause, is displaced onto targets of opportunity. The most vulnerable, least accepted, the perennially non-belonging, become the objects of mounting violence. Last arrived, the most powerless, the first despised. Violence and vulgarity, brutality and bigotry against the vulnerable become the Bitcoin, the currency of the politics of dread. There is accordingly a racial dimension to this elaboration of dread, as Mbembe paves the way to seeing. When Europeans see a black man, he says in the critique of Black Reason, they see nothing. This is, as he puts it, the delirium or mania of race. If delirium produces manic expressions, invariably violent, dread tends to fixate, to fix in place, to render the dreading subject immobile in the face of the dreaded. Delirium and dread dance together, a dance macabre, in the production of disaster. Death is the inevitable end of this dance. Generalizing this, we find ourselves globally as the very outcome, if not condition, of the processes marked as globalization, in the historical conjuncture of a demographic tipping point. And I mean this everywhere. I don't mean in the sense of the 1970s anxieties about the population bomb. As with global warming and climate change, we are deeply into the transformations, demographic, cultural, economic, technological, of which these things serve as the leading edges. So almost every society is becoming more demographically heterogeneous and prolific. The demographic tipping point conjuring such deep anxiety is that of proliferation itself, of mixtures and their manifestations, entanglements and entailments, of the intensifications of these transformations. Here, borders, boundaries, walls, divisions are hardening as impossible resistances to the processes deeper and more profound than they are able to hold off, right? The sense in which people are traversing and undercutting these borderlines. And so this intensification goes beyond what Wendy Brown wrote about as a condition of wars as a condition of neoliberalism in her book on wars, right? I think it's the practice, she was right then, but the practice very quickly has intensified. We've moved from the financialization of everything under neoliberalization to the datafication of everything. Of course, they link. Algorithmifying and appification of our worlds. In this rampant datafication, determinations are replacing choices. The advertising feed incessantly infinitum into our browser based on our current search patterns or just our current location, right? Homo Deus, that book written by Yuval Noah Harari, as homo datafication and deifying AI. They really are out to get you. Dread as the morning in both senses of morning, morning as the dawn of, but morning also in mourning of the pending erasure of human trace. I mean, the algorithmic is taking over and becoming its self-driving condition so that the human is becoming irrelevant and that trace of the human is being rubbed out, right? And so dread, I'm saying, is this mourning, in both senses of mourning of this condition. Dread here is perhaps an invested antipathy, the affect of the nihilistic. In the face of this predicted erasure, as the algorithmic produces its own possibility, its future ontology as the future, its future as ontologically consuming, everything is under suspicion, including claims of by governmentality. A version of this is evident also in the stress on curbing or ending immigration as global movement is unleashed. Génération identitaire bear this out, as does Trumpetarianism. They see in the extreme nowhere to go but to war. Members of the Italian chapter are waging war explicitly, the very term they use, against African migrants at sea. Hiring dinghies are launching into the Mediterranean to prevent African migrants landing on Italian soil. Tragicomically to date, failing miserably in the launch, the dinghies have actually sunk. Right? Be free, you might say, join the army, right? This army that is a self-appointed force. Ironically, the military in this inversion, the military are seen or project themselves as peacemakers, as proliferating informal social armies increasingly insist on a call to arms. So the army become peacemakers and the supposedly peaceful become the forceful army. The privatized militia. Indebtedness is the proliferated condition of being today. I am in debt, therefore I am. But the more deeply I am in the debt I've been urged to take on, individually or collectively, to the point of defaulting, the more readily my being is discounted. Puerto Rico, of course, is just the latest in a long line of debt crises, and Mexico's not far behind, right? Puerto Rico, before the hurricane hit, or the series of hurricanes hit, had $75 billion of debt they couldn't sustain. It's being projected that it's going to cost an additional $95 billion in order to rebuild. So the rebuilding is more than the amount of debt that they're already in, so they're more than doubling the debt. And the US is giving them loans to rebuild, right? They're not forgiving the debt, they're just pushing them more deeply into debt. The more deeply I mean the debt I've been urged to take on individually or collectively, as I said. They are left to go further into debt, simply to reinstate a roof over their heads. Greek austerity, knock, knock, knocking on the next door, no longer heaven's door, right? The very grounds, not the reductive, homogenizing singularity here of my being, is the logic of my unbeing, my undoing. Austerity is financial droning. War is continued, as Lazarate and Alia's comment, through debt. It is not like being in war in their terms, as I say, it is war. Post-colonialism has been superseded by endocolonization, to riff on that term they invoke. They're endocolonized. The new internal colonization that endocolonization references drilled exactly into the body itself. I mean, resonances of Foucault here. Auto-generated, algorithmic, appified house arrest, the bar-coded prison house of self-immobilization. Indebtedness is nothing short of indreadedness, a made-up word I give you. The logic of our times, where the social has become defined totalizingly by divisions, dominations, exploitations. Social subjects have nothing left to lose but their dread. Political warring, I've hinted along the way, is the driving disposition of closure in response to this mounting indreadedness. Race as a political technology colors political warring, gives it content. So you begin to see it, of course, in the militia who's policing the wall that's going up, that's supposedly being paid for by the in-debt Mexican state, which is not being paid for by the Mexican state, that Donald Trump refuses to pay for, so he passes it on to the rest of us, where we go into further debt in order to build something that's unsustainable. Right? Political wars separate, divide space, place people apart from each other. The Berlin Wall, for example. Shape social relations and their lack, or serve really as a refusal of social relation and interactive co-production. Designed to quell the dread, to keep at bay that nebulous, undefined, queasy feeling gnawing at one, political wars serve functionally as a constant visible reminder of anxiety at play. So the way in which you're keeping out the unwanted in order to maintain the wanted within, but the wanted within are not wanted either. Wars heighten the sense of unease. They call the very dread they are supposed to put to rest. Phobogenic technologies, wars intensify the dread rather than holding it at bay. Wars internalize that dis-ease, also disease, populating the imaginary with fantasy objects, shadow fears, puppet fabrications. Wars shield from knowledge exactly, from knowing the ready-made other, the terrain walled off, the work at play on the other side of the wall. Born out of dread, instead of casting it out, walls imprison it within. Race sets up that kind of self-imprisonment, right? Keeping the world outside. Race sets up the boundaries to divide, to set apart, to exclude. In intending to keep out the unwanted, those projected to be threatening, perceive pollutants of the body politic, political wars are constitutively racial. The racial defines the politically polluting in order to fashion a prophylaxis against the infection of the body politic. Racial wars are conceived to operate as a firewall to keep the unwanted and unwashed, the virally infected, at bay. There's an interesting set of images over here, if you think about it. So this is contemporary South Africa on your left, a residence in Johannesburg. In the 1970s, the wall surrounding this house were the stones. That was the wall, right? As apartheid came under duress and ended, the next cement layer got added in the 1980s. And in the 1990s and into the 2000s, you got the fence on top of the wall as the dread, the paranoia deepened. And on top of that, you got electrified fences and barbed wire and so on and so forth, right? Once erected materially or symbolically, conceptually, walls, as I suggest above, also wall in those taking themselves to be threatened. So they both heighten paranoia and enforce or really seek to reinforce isolation, homogeneity, contouring, reproducing like and unlike. I mean, there's a sense in which, in the interest of time, political walls never suffice as such of their own accord to do the political work of walling off, setting apart, delimiting for which they're intended or designed or built. Political walls always require supplementation. They always require the wall to be longer, thicker, higher. They require, you can see the way in which the wall sort of separates out, right? They require that supplementation of which I was speaking, right? The barbed wire, the sparks, the electrification. They require the way in which the military need to supplement it with oversight and technology, right? It needs to be policed. So the wall on its own is always insufficient to carry off the work. They need more land to extend lengthwise or widthwise. They require extended space on either side as webs of patrol and control. So in a way, the wall is a land grab. It's a colonization, not just of the land on which it rests, but of the shaping of the landscape itself, right? So this is Jerusalem, right? You can see the way in which the apartheid wall snakes all around. On your left is Palestine, or the West Bank, and on the right, really on hills, having oversight, as A.L. Weizmann has long argued, having oversight of those beneath them, in every sense of beneath, is Israeli Jerusalem, right? And you can see the way in which the wall sort of snakes along and really marks the landscape, right? Not just the land on which the wall sits. So there are colonizations of the landscape, orderings and contours. Seems at all the right moments, infinitum returns. Wars, of course, they order the flows of capital, financial and human and informational, think firewalls, sculpting the landscape and shaping movements within, along, and beyond. Wars, of course, can have gates built into them, but gates are still extensions of access and control. So you think of the way in which gates are always shaping the flow of people, of human capital, right? Those who hold the power of the gate, the key to the lock, the strings to the moat bridge, control of the cage gamut to get from one side to another or back again, determine who enters and who leaves. That power is always open to corruption, to being bought off, to letting the guard down or distributing keys, all at a price. The price can be death, of course. Life is risked to traverse the wall, physically and imaginatively. The only access points worthy of the political are those made from below, so to speak, punctures, or even puncturing pictures in or on the wall that undermine the points of control, identifying the wall's limit points that free human flow no matter the forces of repression. And there are just a variety of ways in which walls are traversed. I mean, these are just ordinary women going about their daily lives, negotiating the wall sort of that is dividing and shaping and ordering their daily lives, right? You see the way in which the imagination is cutting out the wall, right? These, of course, are Banksy images, right? Or there's an horizon in the wall that's also outside or beyond the wall, right? There's the imagination of control, of delete, right? And so on and so forth. They render the wall more or less irrelevant, more or less impediments to the negotiated in life's movement. The more threateningly irrelevant the wall is made to be or seem, the more extended, the more looming the wall gets to be in imagination and materialization. The answer for dreading subjects to the threat of wall penetration or evasion is, of course, to insist on more wall. Failure here breeds only extension of the logic of delimitation. The premises of political walling are questioned only in the breach of political insurgency. So too in all of this with the racialist political technology. Politics of wars today are in design and effect racial investments. They are racial technologies. Racial wars are once state technologies and contouring architectures of the social. They are architectures born of dread. They reinforce the racial polity, extensions of the racial state, divide, control, rule in and out of dread. Wars then are the central technology of militarizing race and of racial militarization. Their end game is homogenization of the social, to keep out the enemy where the enemy is massified, racially driven and identified poverty. Why did we build the wall, my children, my children? We build the wall to keep out the enemy. Who's the enemy, my children, my children? The enemy is poverty, my children, my children. To outsource the dread, walls weaponize the racial, just as walls physically are erected, the very term signaling the masculinized penetration of landscape and population, so they are supplemented by the virtualization of techno-walling off. Witness the siloing effects of algorithmic intensification of narrowed social preferences, the transforming of biopower into biometric power, of identity into official identification. These developments effectively virtualize walled-off socialities, the belonging and excluded, the socially living and eliminated. Trumpetarianism, yes, a made-up word to signify a newly made-up version of the reinvented raciality, and it includes Brexiteering, or the franticness of France, the kind of voter whining of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, AfD in Germany, the kind of Putrinisme around Putin, you might say, to riff on this Netanyahuing, right, in a certain sort of way, and so on, represents the latest articulation of this homogenizing parochialism. This retreat into a walling off solipsism can only come with and as violence generalized to the social condition at large, as much hermeneutically as materially. In this sense, you call the kind of political walling as a kiss of social death, right? That the kind of anonymity of the resistance to this condition. If dread is a leakage from and into this reach for social purification, there's no walling it off. Like air pollution or the nuclear cloud or debt for that matter, it knows no walling off. There is no wall that can contain it. No political or national boundaries. It seeps insidiously into the body politic, polluting its psychic life. Political wars and the wars of race thus invariably involve force. They require force to build and sustain, to cite as infrastructures of division, and they embody force in undertaking to divide and exclude, to contour the in and the out, and their conditions for reproduction. So one can ask whether dread then can operate as a political concept. Does dread signify or signal a politics of the counter, most pressingly to the concretizations produced out of indreadedness? Occupy, you might ask, World Social Forum, you could ask, flash mobs, mobilizing immobilities, or sort of one-offs. What might algorithmic political counter-mobilization, counter-immobilities, for want of a better way of putting it, look like? Something like Black Lives Matter, terrorism as a sole possibility, left with everything to fear and nothing left to lose, as the death of even the possibility of politics. What in short of activism in the face of or in response to, in refusal of dread and its walling extensions? Anti-racist activism in its most well-articulated expressions is, to generalize, the refusal of dread and its concretions. It always has been. It is a refusal to be frozen into the delimitation and intimidation, to be defined ultimately by racial dominance, by the forces of whiteness and those allied with those forces. It is the insistence on not being defined and bounded by, restricted to or within the confining walls. I mean, I was talking about this in an interview I did just before we started. This is Marlene Dumas' wonderful two canvases, the very large canvases, Caught Against the Wall. If you don't know them, go and check them out. So that, of course, is the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, right, where religious Jews and Jews of all kinds go and pray. And this is the apartheid wall. And what she's done is inverted the iconography. Palestinians are being arrested against the Wailing Wall, right, the wailing of the Wailing Wall. And Jews are praying against the apartheid wall, religious Jews. And it just stops you up short about how to think about these conditions at work over here. Activism today, and youth activism especially, is fueled by lightning interventions at best, by outbreak culture at worst. Outbreak culture, a term articulated by a former PhD student of mine, is event-driven. Attention is paid when a notable event sparking significant media interest and screen time grabs attention. His name's Duran Verladen, a very interesting thinker. As soon as attention wanes, moves on to the next event, interest goes dormant, or at least less visible. Outbreak culture is largely defined by a common set of interventions. A disturbing event prompts expressions of outrage, rallies, often clashing with explicitly racist groups, and more often than not, the police. It fills social media feeds, Facebook walls again, producing self-satisfaction in having participated in something, said something, sewing one into a commitment with and to others. So they shouldn't be downplayed. Outbreaks are part of a contemporary disruption culture, responses to moments of crisis. Crises come and go. It's the nature of crisis. Wax and wane, in effects and responses, activities and implications. Disruptions as such tend to be momentary, reverting to the status quo ante. They gesture at significant redirection while more than at ease with reverting to, even depending on existing structures and ways of doing things, while appearing to be radically redirecting and maybe then descend back into dread. If everyday racisms are increasingly shadowed, eclipsed, overlooked, rendered invisible by outbreak racism, mainstream responses likewise assume the form and structure of outbreaks. You can ask whether #MeToo is a version of this, right? That's, again, not to belittle these momentary interventions, but what are the long-term transformative effects and impacts of this? And as such, they tend to take on the expression not even of mea culpas, but momentary addresses, superficial rather than redress. Keep the peace. Contrast all this with the politics of coalition. Sensitive, nimble, agile, cross-racial, cross-class, cross-gender, and generational, so key to the history of effective anti-racist struggles and movements. Angela Davis has made extensive work of this. A picture recently went viral of a young South Asian woman, Sophia Khan, this was 6 months or so ago, casually dressed within arm's length of a Keep Britain White invader, dressed in the black English Defence League sports shirt at an EDL street march in Birmingham, Britain's most diverse city. So these are two versions of the image that went viral, right? He looks to be protesting her very presence. She is confidently half smiling at him, hands deep in her pockets, amused at his foolishness, no doubt thinking how utterly idiotic he is being. The problem is all yours, she seems to be saying. Indeed, the problem is you. The calmness, the self-confidence, conveying the sense that she fully belongs, lives in and is of the city, in contrast to the violent, shouting, red-faced imposter, the crusading invader. Take a deep breath, calm down, and then perhaps I can tell you a bit about who we are, what we bring to this place, how we make it, and you all better off. You are the proverbial wall, the self-proclaimed barrier, the ultimate outcome of which is social nihilism. You are the person who, when you have a chance to hire, look in the mirror and say, you want someone exactly alike, who works as you work, does what you do. But why? You may as well just talk to yourself while you look at yourself narcissistically in the mirror. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Crack. I am the product, Sophia Khan is saying, of openness, of welcome, of hospitality, of the to-be. The intimated advice, were it to be taken up, would indeed bear her out. The English Defence League looks to return to a fabricated past, a purifying myth that never was. Sophia Khan is a future to which we would all be far better off aspiring. This in turn reveals the necessity and range of the coalitions at work. The most effective large-scale anti-racist movements, think historically, abolition, civil rights, anti-apartheid, have been cross-racial, multi-gendered, multi-generational, and cross-class, local and global. They seek to tear down the racial walls of division and social dread, to crack the mirror of self-reproduction, social constraint, cultural delimitation, of narcissistic nihilism exactly. The leadership has been intersectional, ever mindful of the concerns of constituencies represented by other than their own. There's a driving necessity to be open, inviting, exciting, not shutting down by shutting up and shouting out. But then this has to translate into concrete developments, visible transformations of the commonplace to the betterment, as I say, of all. The question this raises is how to maintain sustainable critical attention to issues of racial injustice and repression in the face of outbreak and event culture, where the politics of irritation have erupted into the politics of enough. The commitment to justice is never a one-off. It requires a sustained coalitional commitment to the causes and outcomes, is incessant attention and persistent embrace and sustained dignity of the face of all too indignity. So here are a couple of examples. Right, this in the wake of the Michael Brown killing in Ferguson, where instead of only or restricting oneself to taking to the streets and clashing with police, die-ins at malls as a way of appealing to those going about their everyday shopping in order to stop them up short. Or again, going to the Saturday Night Symphony Orchestra, and in the middle of the orchestra unfolding barriers and starting to sing "Whose Side Are You On" to the dressed up, right, tuxedo-dressed kind of patron of the orchestra in the city of St. Louis, just as a way of stopping people short in this sense. There's a long tradition, of course, of the use of art, the use of walls as artistic intervention. I mean, Diego Rivera, the form of graffiti, Sophia Town in South Africa, just a simple "we won't move," the way in which, right, there's a kind of self-ironizing of the wall. Obviously, the putting of this up in Baghdad, right, in the wake of Abu Ghraib. Again, the insistence that the wall is not there forever, the inversion of who's in control. You've got to love this image, right? The turning upside down of who holds power. I mean, just ways of indicating a kind of set of interventions. And of course, JR, right, whether in the favelas in Brazil or across the wall here, right, overseeing the wall. I mean, just bringing people up short and getting them to think anew about the very condition that they're creating in terms of the wall. The kind of ironizing of the sense of being watched and who's watching whom over here. And then again, a sort of Banksy-esque kind of undertaking. And then the way in which these kinds of activisms play out, right, by taking a watchtower in the apartheid wall and making it self-conscious about what it's doing. So anybody witnessing this on the Israeli side of the wall, not on the Palestinian side, are, right, sort of brought up short about the very condition that they're creating and so on. So I'm just going to go through this. A couple of examples. Crowd Voice, which is Ezra Al-Shafai out of Bahrain, a global kind of youth network for daily news that is cited around, literally around the world, as a counter voice to the repression that they're suffering in whatever site from which they're coming. I mean, all political forms of news that are using the technologies in order to be able to get at these things, or Ricardo Dominguez and electronic civil disobedience using electronic, I mean, he's been doing this for 20 years, right? Electronic media to create compasses to leave in the desert, electronic digital compasses to leave in the desert, not illegal for people trying to get across the desert to pick up and get across the border, enablements of this kind. I mean, these sorts of disobedience. I'll just end with this kind of ironizing. Right? We don't want your money, we want your change, right? It's a kind of the way in which, right, there's a kind of insiding of sort of conditions of being together, a reference to Martin Luther King, kind of thing, or the use of political contours to say who should be locked up over here, right? So the sense of doing things together, that we owe it to each other to, in a sense, in the spirit of the walls of Jericho, to out-trumpet the wallsters, to bring down the walls of Jericho. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Gracias. Bueno, creo que ha sido una magnífica conferencia para dar inicio a lo que toca el día de hoy. Me gustaría abrir unos minutos para, si tienen algunas dudas, rescatando ciertos puntos de lo que David acaba de decir, sobre todo la manera en la que se han concebido a los muros como una representación simbólica del poder, y de qué manera hoy en día, a través de ciertos discursos, a través de una fuerza absoluta del discurso del poder, en el caso de Trump, en el caso de otros lados, se genera una cierta fantasía de la necesidad de esos muros para delimitar el espacio, pero sobre todo para estar y sentirse seguro, al mismo tiempo que una compulsión por hacer creer que eso es lo que toca en el mundo contemporáneo. Y eso no ha hecho más que crecer distintas formas de racismo, distintos espacios y espaciamientos en donde se generan muros también de manera virtual, desechando o buscando dejar de fuera a lo que durante muchos años la política y la soberanía estatal ha buscado llamar el enemigo, pero que sin embargo hoy eso deviene en condiciones de precariedad para todos aquellos desechados, despojados de cualquier tipo de derecho. Ha sido una gran conferencia, creo que podríamos darle mucho tiempo a las preguntas, pero demos unos minutos por si ustedes tienen algún comentario o alguna pregunta que hacer, por favor. Si levantan la mano, por ahí les acercarán el micrófono, por favor. Sí, ahorita te acercan un micrófono para que se escuche bien, por favor. Por allá me pueden acercar un micrófono. Ah, gracias.
Gracias. Soy Margarita Guillén, me parece muy interesante toda la conferencia. Y lo que me queda de duda es, con todos estos años de estudio que usted tiene, ¿cómo ha venido a entender cómo funciona en la mente de los seres humanos esa supremacía racial o esa inferioridad racial que se creen unos y los otros, a partir de las cuales surgen estas diferencias? ¿O las entendemos, o las razonamos, o se naturalizan?
Yeah, so this is about the psychologics, you might say, of racism. Let me just step back for a moment and make an argument about racism that puts this in context. Racism is a condition of power, a relational condition of power. Racism comes of age in modern life, by which I mean in modernity, from roughly explicitly from the 1450s onwards. That's not to say you don't have discrimination prior to that. Even prototypes of classification systems and so on in in the case of the founding of the English nation and so on. But it's from the 1450s onwards that race becomes a condition of state power, increasingly. Bit by bit by bit, it transforms. I mean, the reason race gets taken up, not unlike religion, is that it's motile in its conceptual and symbolic apparatus, right? It can work at the level of the individual, and it works at the level of the state and of institutions in between. And it's a condition which is taken up in order to shape the body politic. And so the psychology of, racism is not a natural condition. Nobody's born a racist, right? And indeed, there are no genes for race. There are genes for skin color, there are genes for eyes, nose shape, hair, if you have it or if you don't, and so on and so forth, right? Those are not inherited from one's racial pool. They're inherited from your mommy and daddy and mommy and daddy's mommies and daddies, right? Going back ad infinitum. So race itself is an artifice, and it shapes the way in which people are ordered and think in their coming or being brought into the world in every sense of the term. So that psychologics of racism is a condition of the possibility of the existence, the proliferation, the profusion of racisms in place and time, which both change over time and take hold more firmly in some places and sometimes than others. And so when a child of 5 or 6 starts spouting off, derogatory racist expression, it's a function of the condition in which he's being brought up, both in the household but also beyond, right? And there's also a kind of disposition of being in the world. I mean, I got brought up in a very racist society, Cape Town, South Africa, right? My family always had black people, black person living in the house with us, right? When you think about that, I mean, that, of course, was a product of the racist condition called apartheid. I mean, black people were domestic labor, servants, right? But there's a sense in which, right, if you don't inherit a condition of shared humanity when living together with a person, even under those kinds of ununiform power conditions where a 6-year-old can tell a 40-year-old, make my bed, clean my shoes, right? It's, when you rub elbows together with each other, if something is not running off, right, in your humanity, where you're waking up to the fact that you have a shared humanity, there's no hope for you, right? I mean, what to say.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
¿Me podría aclarar cómo se produce el temor con la tecnología digital? A mí no me quedó muy claro, aunque entiendo que la tecnología, lo digital absorbe mucho nuestro sentido humanitario.
Yeah. So technologies reinforce, you might say, pre-existing conditions. So the dread is a product of the political, as I'm putting it, and the contrast I made with fear and the likeness with melancholia is that there's no particularly defined object of dread, right? I mean, the proliferation of dread is a function of the fact that you can't name its object, right? If you could name its object, you could address its object and begin to sort of say, well, how can I undo that object so that I'm not constantly waking up every morning? Getting rid of Donald Trump won't I'm afraid, end my dread tomorrow morning, right? Unfortunately, because there are a whole bunch of other people around him who are equally dreadful, right? Dread-making. So dread, as I'm putting it, is a function of the political condition which we found ourselves, where war and civil war and the conditions are increasingly common. A kind of unnamed civil war. Everything's called war, but civil war is sort of not named or is trivialized and so on. That sense of being at odds with everybody else in the world, right? And what technology does is it exacerbates that. I mean, it exacerbates that by removing our sense of control over the conditions of our lives. So the fact that you're getting, how when you look up, I don't know, flying on KLM, just to take one example that often happens to me. You want to buy a ticket on an airline, Aeromexico or something like that, and then you log out of the airline and you go back to your daily work, and you're checking something online having to do with your daily work, and all of a sudden there's a feed, take a wonderful holiday in Thailand, care of KLM or Aeromexico, and so on and so forth, right? I have no interest in taking a wonderful holiday in Thailand. Please don't interrupt my attention span, because I'm deep into something else, thinking about the dread that you're producing in me, right? So the technology, I mean, it's a facile way of saying that the technology, precisely because there's a sense in which we have either no control or at least not full control over it, it's being fed by other networked sets of conditions, is increasingly amplifying the loss of autonomy. And that loss of autonomy is then translating into a condition of dreadfulness. And as the technology becomes even less controlled by the human, that condition is becoming amplified, right? So the news feeds you're getting are not, you can make an analogy with the way in which music is algorithmically produced today. So algo raves. Algo raves are big rave dances where somebody writes a line of music code, and then the code reproduces itself in new forms of music, independent of the coder who has written the first line. Well, increasingly, algorithms are writing their own code, right? So increasingly, we're losing control even over the capacity to write our own code, which then exacerbates that proliferating condition of dread that I'm speaking to.
Okay. Brad?
Thanks, David. I guess two comments, and I guess lead into a question. The first thing which I like in which you're framing this is in terms of a narrative of global civil war, which is kind of what Carl Schmitt kind of alluded to in terms of the breakup of the liberal order. And one of the interesting things I think about, as you talked about, there's this war on everything today, right? And in the context, we're almost in a condition of beyond war, where it's become so normalized it no longer even needs to be declared any longer. And that's kind of an interesting configuration in terms of thinking about the spatial dimensions to raciality, and raciality is spatiality, right, as you rightly point out. But I'm kind of interested in your inversion around the question of walling, because we often think, especially in the context of Europe, that the walls are actually to keep people out. And we've had this in the UK with Brexit, right? My first reaction after Brexit was, shit, right? I'm stuck on this island with these people. And it's kind of this kind of logical inversion, because walls are not just about keeping people out, it's about keeping people in as well, as you rightly point. And I wonder how this kind of connects with the changing nature of global capitalism, which no longer actually requires the vast majority of the world's citizens. And how does this kind of work out in terms of, how do we get the masses to desire their own veritable containment? Right? And I'm kind of interested in maybe your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an important, very interesting and complicated question, right? I mean, so the reference to, in passing, to Foucault's drilling down sort of inside the body itself, right? So that, I mean, there are a number of things going on. I mean, first, as you say, global capital has become unbounded increasingly, and so it intensifies its profitability, its surplus value, so to speak. I mean, in a way, its surplus value is now infinite, right? Because it needs less and less labor in order to produce it. Right? But in the end, in order, you know, I guess two elements to the virtue of capital in this sort of global condition. I mean, one is that that it is able to reproduce itself without limit, its infinity, its infinitum, on the one hand, and on the other, that it gets to be, well, no longer that it gets to be enjoyed sort of materially on the ground, though that too, I mean, you buy up whatever you want to buy up, right? But that it represents absolutizing power, right? So it's no longer that I'm enjoying the material benefits of being rich, although rich people are enjoying that. You know, I can buy an island, I can disappear, I don't have to go to an airport in order to fly. I mean, all those things. I mean, but that's almost no longer the point, right? The point is increasingly my power to conduct myself as a global capitalist becomes limitless as well, right? So capital is largely, not exclusively, and might never, but is largely losing its need to land anywhere. And that's different than previous forms of capital, right? I mean, before that kind of containability was in order to securitize oneself against somebody taking the goodies that belong to me, that Hobbesian condition, right? So now the question is, okay, we don't want people to rebel because, of course, if capital doesn't exactly have to land in most of its manifestations anywhere, I need to live somewhere, right? Or travel through places or interact with people that are engaging in these activities. So it doesn't lose its entire materiality. And that requires a sense of keeping the wolves at bay, right? You know, in that kind of Don DeLillo kind of sense of the apocalyptic sort of coming down on Manhattan at the time of cosmopolitanism, right, sort of as a response. And so the question of how this gets enacted is largely by I guess a double condition. One is the waging of war on everything. I mean, so that would be, you know, that the notion of civil war does become sort of politically animated by the set of the logics of global capital on the one hand. And then within that kind of civil war, which of course is also generative of the weaponized sort of production of further capital, right? It is getting people who once thought they have had a degree of privilege and power that was racially driven, namely white working class people, right, to become the front line in the waging of civil war on those who are taken not or should not belong, right? And so race is being reinscribed in all sorts of, hyper-ventilated, gated, walled communities in all kinds of places, in Lagos, for example, you know, which then gets run over by flooding water that is uncontainable, right? So these gated communities are built in order to wall out the poor, and all of a sudden, you know, people are left with nothing because they've forgotten to plan about water floods, right? And so on. So there's in a way, as the Civil War kind of ramps up, the war on the environment ramps up too, right? Or the war with the environment, or the impacts on the environment, and you know, the planning for those outcomes, the infrastructural planning, is 50 years old, right? It like just hasn't. So there's an interesting introversion, a kind of collapsing in on itself that one's constantly seeing as a function of all of this. That it does require more sustained thought. Thanks.
Creo que por ahí alguien quiere preguntar. Será la última pregunta para dar paso a la siguiente, al primer panel, por favor.
Muchas gracias por su conferencia. Yo quería preguntarle...
Where are you?
Aquí.
Okay.
Hace unos años usted hablaba, sobre todo durante la administración de Obama, del riesgo que tenía pensar que estábamos entrando en una especie de era post-racial y que va ligada a una especie de, pues, de paso del racismo a la esfera de lo privado, donde el Estado ya no tenía nada que ver o que decir o en que participar. No sé si nos puede hablar un poco de qué pasa con la llegada de Trump y cómo se reconfigura esta dicotomía, este juego entre lo público y lo privado alrededor del racismo.
Yeah, that's also a very interesting question. Thank you. So my argument, just for those who don't know it, was that under post-raciality, so a book I wrote published a couple of years ago called Are We All Post-Racial Yet? To which my answer was yes, but for all the wrong reasons, right? The post-racial is a contemporary mentality of racism, right? And I mean, as the question or the comment intimated, that involved the shifting away of the power of racism from the power of the state into privatized spheres, and the role of the state was to protect those privatized spheres, right, in its expressibility in racist ways, right? So the state still had a role to play. It wasn't giving up the role. It was just saying, you know, through free speech, through the protection of privatized free speech, you can say and do pretty much anything, right? And racism got reignited, dramatically reignited, sort of in that modality. I think what Trump has done is that he's recollapsed the public and the private once again, right? So he's occupying a public position, even though you wouldn't know it from his behavior, right? So he's using the instrumentalities of the power of that position, but he's acting as if he were a private citizen and enabling or empowering himself and those around him to speak and say and do whatever they want in the name of that, you know. So his tweeting is exactly an expression of that. I mean, which president prior to this or anywhere else tweets other than to promote the kind of legislation that just passed, or to, you know, promote the society in order to get behind some legislation or something, you know, a more traditional form of the political, right? Trump, I think, has collapsed the private and public in a way that we haven't seen quite before, you know, and you know, I don't want to say he's mastered the technologies, because all he knows how to do is tweet, right? He's an illiterate, quite literally an illiterate. He's never read a book, including the one that has his name on it, right? So kind of, I mean, literally, it was written for him, right? But he has mastered a capacity of these forms of collapse, and I want to say sort of operates by exacerbating dread, that he is the president of dread. He's both the dreadful president and the president of dread, right? If we're going to collapse, if we're going to extend this collapsing of, yeah, that phenomenologically screwed condition that I referenced at the beginning. And so I think there's a real way in which he represents a new turn to this condition. But you're seeing it elsewhere as well. I was having a conversation with folks in Europe at the beginning of this week on Skype, who were commenting on the way in which you know, the post-racial turn itself in Europe has now taken a set of new turns differently in different sites in and across Europe, precisely because the populations have proliferated in different ways. The anxieties, the dread, the you know, sort of both is conjured and then reinforced politically in campaigns, in the maintenance of power, in keeping people in place in some ways, in getting people to police themselves, through policing others and so on and so, keeping others out and so on and so forth, right? That re-inscription of the nation as the bound, some fantasized nation, imagined community, right? As the bounded of who belongs and who doesn't, in societies that no longer are constituted demographically in those ways whatsoever. There's no, if there ever were pure societies, there are none left, right? Anywhere, show me one,
Thank you very much, David. Bueno, gracias a todos. Daremos inicio al primer panel en el que nos estarán acompañando Ángel Álvarez, Yerko Castro, Mariana Mora y moderará Enrique Díaz. Gracias. Gracias, David. Thank you very much. Si quieren, pueden tomar 5 minutitos de break en lo que se organiza todo el asunto técnico de la mesa.